I love Lorna's picture that she came and shared earlier on, right at the start, with a sheep up on its back, needing the help of others, and that place of kind of vulnerability, and that place of dependency on those around them as part of that, and just gives a kind of a really powerful picture of something that's really on my heart for today and things. I said at the start of the service too, I love the swap shop yesterday. It was great, regardless of all the stuff and the different things and all that going on, just to be together, just that sense of community, that sense of opportunity to be a family who share what we have was a really precious time. And it's precious because community is something that is so important and so needed, and yet it is becoming something that is increasingly rare. I think there's a few different reasons for that. I think one of the key reasons for that is the development of technology that we've seen. Technology enables us to do some amazing things. I love technology. Those of you who know me know that in many ways I'm a bit of a geek, and so technology is something which is right up my street. But how easy is it to do life without ever seeing anyone, apart from the delivery man? I don't think any of us can do life without seeing the delivery man. Anything and everything, you could possibly want, you can buy online and have brought straight to your door. You never need to leave your house and actually engage or see other people. The bit of technology that I think has probably had the biggest impact on our lives and kind of sums it all up, though, is this, isn't it? It's the mobile phone. And I've started to even think that name is just ridiculous now. Because, we call it a phone, but not only does it do so much more than being a phone, but actually the phone is the bit that we probably use the least. The phone is the bit that most of us actually, when the phone goes, we kind of freak out and we go, well, why aren't they sending me a message? I don't want to talk to anyone. Why do we call it a mobile phone anymore? It's just this kind of mobile device, this thing that kind of rules our lives in so many different ways. And I have a bit of a love-hate relationship with my phone. I don't know about you. I love having everything at my fingertips. But, I hate the way it has that kind of pull on me at times to keep checking it at different points, to keep on scrolling in different ways, and the kind of expectations that come with the assumption that we're constantly connected. In lots of ways, technology does help us to feel connected, doesn't it? But it's a connection in a way that keeps people at a distance, where what we see and we know of a person and what we allow others to see and know of us is only what we want, is only a curated bit of the picture. And then alongside the rise of technology, there's been a message that's kind of come through in culture, a message of our world that has shaped so much of the way that we kind of approach things and do things, which has increasingly been, you can do it. You don't need anyone else. Don't rely on other people. To rely on other people is weakness. Don't let anyone else tell you what's right and wrong. You be you. Do what makes you feel good. And it's a message that leads to our whole world becoming centered on ourselves. And so community breaks down. Because we only engage when it's convenient or when we feel like it. We struggle to commit because we want to wait until we see how we feel at the time or to see if something better might come along. And I get it because that's how I can think sometimes. The problem is that it doesn't do us any good. Here are a few statistics that kind of sum up the problem that we're facing in our world and in the way that we've been shaped by this thinking. And these statistics are American, but I think would be pretty similar here. Here we go. 47% of all people say that their relationships with others are not meaningful. And 25% would say they have no one they would consider a close confidant. 52% of all people, and this is the one that really shocks me because I'm in this category, 73% of millennials say they are lonely. That's shocking, isn't it? Mother Teresa put it this way. She said that loneliness is the leprosy of the modern world. And that's really sad, isn't it? And it might be that actually you're here today and you're feeling lonely. You know, we can feel lonely while being connected because so much of our connection is a connection that keeps people at a distance. Because when we feel like our relationships are shallow, our soul longs for something more. And that's because God did not design you and I to do life or to be in relationship in that kind of a way, in the kind of a way where we're connected but at a distance. And I said last week, for those of you who are here, that you were not designed to do life on your own or to be in control, but to do life with God and dependent on God. We're made for relationship with Him and to depend on Him. But here's the thing. God made you to need more than just Him. Not only were you designed to do life with God and dependent on God, but you were designed to do life with others and dependent on others. You were designed to do life in meaningful community. And we see this right from the beginning. If you go all the way back to the creation with Genesis chapter 1, God creates the heavens and the earth, and He says, let there be light, and there was light, and then He says, it was good. And this becomes a bit of a mantra as you go through the creation story. He creates the water and the sky and the dry ground, and God saw that it was good. And then He creates the trees and the animals and the birds of the air and the fish in the sea, and He says, it was good. Then we turn to Genesis chapter 2. And after God's created Adam, He says something is not good. In Genesis 2 verse 18, it says, then the Lord God said, it is not good for the man to be alone. I will make a helper who is just right for him. And Adam had an amazing, intimate, face-to-face relationship with God in a way that so many of us long for. He did life with God and dependent on God, but it wasn't enough. God saw that He had no one to share life with, to celebrate the joys and of the day with, to cry with when things were hurting, to laugh with. And He says, that's not good. And so in verse 22 we read this, it says, then the Lord God made a woman from the rib, and He brought her to the man. At last, the man exclaimed. How many men can relate to that? You know, we are not designed to do life or to follow Jesus on our own, but with others and dependent on others. Independence was never a part of God's plan, and neither was loneliness. And so today, as we continue our series looking at how we can learn from Jesus, His better way, a way that leads to life and life to the full, we're going to be talking about the way of community. And this is actually something that Jesus models to us in a really powerful way that we can somehow kind of miss and skip over so often. You know, when we read about how Jesus calls different people to come and follow Him, it's something that's so easy to miss. You know, Jesus never calls someone to follow Him on their own, to some kind of one-on-one journey of kind of Jesus and me. That just Jesus and me is all I need. Now, every time Jesus calls someone to follow Him, He calls them to join a community of people who are following Him together. And it starts off with a bunch of fishermen. And they all kind of know each other, and so they've got a lot in common. And you can imagine it at the beginning, when you get that kind of picture, you can imagine it being a bit like a friendship group and things and all that going on. But it doesn't stay that way long. A little later, Jesus has a large group of followers, and we don't know the exact number, but it was probably in the hundreds. And then from that, this large group, He calls out 12, who he kind of invites into an intimate kind of relationship of doing life with Him. And in Matthew 10, is one of the places where we're told who they are. This is what it says. These are the names of the 12 apostles. First, Simon, who is called Peter, and his brother Andrew. James, son of Zebedee, and his brother John. Philip and Bartholomew. Thomas and Matthew, the tax collector. James, son of Alphaeus and Thaddeus. Simon the zealot, and Judas Iscariot, who betrayed him. Now, often, when you get a list of names, it's one of those things you kind of just skim over as you're reading through the Bible, isn't it? We don't think much more of it. But it gives us a picture of the community that Jesus has gathered around in, the community of people who follow Jesus together, who do life and eat together and travel together and learn together day in and day out. And what's interesting is that there's only two people that in this it kind of picks out to give us a description of: Matthew the tax collector and Simon the zealot. And suddenly this doesn't look much like a friendship group anymore. You see, Simon was a zealot, and we don't have much of an idea of zealots, but when you think zealot, what I want you to think is essentially Islamic terrorist. You know, he was a fundamental right-wing Jew who wanted to see Israel become a great nation again and believed the only way that was going to happen was through violently attacking the Roman oppressors that were with them at that time. You know, he was a man who probably killed people in that aim. And then Matthew is a tax collector, which means he's literally on the payroll of the Romans. And so you can imagine them sat there, and Simon looks over at Matthew and over coffee in the morning, traitor. How could you do that? And Matthew looks over at Simon and he says, murderer, terrorist. You know, these are two people who are fundamentally opposed to each other in their beliefs, in their ideology, in their background, in their politics. Now, I can't imagine as they did life together and they ate together and they had all these conversations over meals that it was always easy and nice and just kind of all smiles and everyone getting on well. You know, and we see this, don't we, as you read through it, and again, we can skip over it so easily. You know, the number of stories that we come across where the disciples, they fall out with each other, when they argue over who it is that's the greatest. And Jesus, he gives these beautiful teachings of the ideals of what community should look like, that we love one another and we turn the other cheek and we forgive one another. But the reality of the community that's actually living around him is that it's messy. And actually, that's what we see as we kind of look at the picture of the church as we go forwards. The community of people who gather together as followers of Jesus all throughout the New Testament. You know, so many of Paul's letters, they are written to try and address problems that are found in the midst of a messy community. You know, he starts off by teaching some fantastic stuff that we learn from about who Jesus is and about what he's done for us and who we are as a result and the life that we have in him and how we're loved by God and we're forgiven and all of this kind of stuff. And then he says, and because of all that, now live like this. Treat each other like this. Love one another. Forgive one another, bear one another's burdens, encourage one another, be at peace with one another, confess sins to one another, serve one another, comfort one another, speak truth to one another, pray for one another, meet one another's needs, be hospitable to one another. He just goes on and on and on. The Bible has a lot to say about how we relate to one another, a lot to say about what it is to be community. And in all, to me, it seems like there are two assumptions that are made. The first is that as a follower of Jesus, you are in community. Not just attending a service on a Sunday morning, but in a community. A community where you are known and where you know others. And then the second assumption that I think is pretty clear is that community is messy. That as we look to follow Jesus together, we need to be reminded and encouraged and challenged to love and to bear with and to forgive again and again. And it's true, isn't it? You know, some of you haven't been around in church here all that long. And, you know, when you first join a church, and you might not be feeling like this, you might feel very differently. But, you know, in my experience, when I've joined different places and been part of things, when you first walk in, you think it's great. You think everything's amazing, and everyone's so lovely. And, you know, and it's just this wonderful kind of place. And then after you've been around for a while, the things that aren't so good start to stand out, don't they? And you start to realize, oh, they've got a bit of an annoying habit. Wish they didn't do that. Winds me up. Wish they did things a bit differently. Wish they did it more how I wanted them to do it. And it's always the case in every community. Because there is no perfect church and there is no perfect community. You know, when you bring together a bunch of people who are so different to do life, it gets messy. But as we stick with one another and we learn together in the midst of the messiness, even through the misunderstandings and the hurts, and we bear with and we forgive, that's when it becomes beautiful. That's actually the community where we're able to be real and we're able to be known and to know, to have deep and meaningful relationships that shine in the way that God intends as those who love one another, despite all of our differences, despite things not always being the way we'd want them to be. And so as we look to learn from Jesus a better way, there are three things I want us to kind of try and get hold of when we think about what it looks like to learn from him the way of community. The first one's this. Community is not optional. God adopts us into family. You know, an idea that's been on the rise, particularly following on from all the challenges of COVID, is the idea that as a follower of Jesus, I don't need church. I can follow Jesus on my own. Maybe it's nice, but I don't need it. And in some ways, it doesn't sound like that big of a deal. But it's actually an incredibly dangerous lie of the enemy. This idea that it's just me and Jesus is an idea that we don't find anywhere in the whole of the Bible. Instead, the image that we find being used again and again and again, to talk about followers of Jesus, it is that we are adopted into family. And we see this in lots of different places, but I think one of the most striking is when Jesus starts talking about it, and he's not even trying to teach, he's just almost like this throwaway comment in the midst of things that just is pretty shocking at the time. You know, yes, we get the whole thing in terms of where Jesus teaches us to pray to God as our Father and that kind of him and me kind of moment, but there's a time in Mark 3 when Jesus' mother and brothers come to see him, and this is what he says. He says, "Who are my mother and my brothers?" he asked. Then he looked at those seated in a circle around him and said, "Here are my mother and my brothers. Whoever does God's will is my brother and sister and mother." Jesus talks about those who follow him as his family. And that becomes the main way that followers of Jesus relate to one another as you read through the New Testament. It's as family, as brothers and sisters. And this idea of family, it sounds really nice, doesn't it? And we get this kind of picture sometimes when we talk about the church as being family as this kind of really lovely, kind of nice thing. But let's be honest, how many of us have always felt that way when it comes to our kind of natural family? You know, in fact, for some of you probably here, your experience in terms of your natural family is not a nice and pleasant, fun thing which gives you a smile on your face. It's painful. And so you might find this image of the church as family a hard one. You know, but whatever your experience in terms of natural family, when you come to follow Jesus, you are adopted into God's great family. You are not only loved by him as your heavenly Father in that way that Rose kind of came to express and to share was on his heart earlier, but you are joined with brothers and sisters here and now, who you know will actually be your family forever, for eternity. And as you look around the room, I don't know if that puts a smile on your face and you go, oh, how lovey-dovey is this family, or if actually your kind of heart sinks. But here's the thing. There is nothing optional about family. People simply are our family, whether we like it or not. And family, when we like them and when we don't feel like we like them, we still prioritize them, don't we? Even when it's inconvenient. You know, our family walk with us through the highs and the lows. We might not always see eye to eye. We might not always agree with each other. We might not even always get on. But we are committed to doing life together. You know, family eats together. They share their resources together. Family makes decisions together. Holds each other accountable. They're willing to say the hard things. They're faithful to each other. Family won't necessarily be friends. You know, sometimes it works out that way with family, which is brilliant, but it doesn't always, does it? You know, friendship is based on chemistry and personality and shared interests and stages of life. But family is different. Some family you get on with like friends, and some family you don't. But either way, you're still family, and so you show up and you do life together. I think one of the things that can be a great barrier in terms of connecting in terms of church is when we start to think like family, but in our mind we translate that to be one big friendship group. And it isn't. It's family. You know, there are times when I go and visit my family. I have to be careful, some of my family are here. There are times when I go and visit my family, and it doesn't flow. And it's not like this great kind of friendship thing and you're sitting there. Actually, what it is being companionable while you sit and graze at the snack table. But you want to be there with one another because you're family. You see, nowhere do we get anything like the kind of idea that church is about coming to a service once in a while, or even once a week on a Sunday, or that it's this thing that we engage with when it's convenient, or when we feel like it, or whatever level we feel comfortable with. Church is a family that we are part of, a group of people who care for one another, who do life together, who call on each other when they need help, who see each other on their good days and on their bad days, because we don't just kind of curate the picture of who we are for family, do we? Who put up with each other and who love each other through it all. I want to ask you a quick question, and I'm just going to give you 30 seconds or so to think about it. If you've got one of the notepads that's available at the table, you can grab one if it helps to make you some notes to come back to. But here's a question just to think about for a moment, and maybe pray through it another time. How does your experience of church and your approach to church, and that second one's just as important, how do you approach church? How does your experience of church and your approach to church fit with this idea of family? I'll give you 30 seconds. Have a think about it. Make some notes. You can come back to it later. Okay, so number one, community is not optional because God adopts us into family. Number two, then, community is something that you need and somewhere that you are needed. One of the great pictures that we get of this in the New Testament is the picture of the church as a body. You know, I love the way Paul writes about this, and I'm going to read it from the Message translation because he just kind of captures things so well. In Romans 12, he says this: "In this way, we are like the various parts of a human body. Each part gets its meaning from the body as a whole, not the other way around." I love that. You know, you get your meaning, you discover something of who you are from the body, being part of the body as a whole. The body we're talking about is Christ's body of chosen people. Each of us finds our meaning and function as a part of his body. But as a chopped off finger or a cut off toe, we wouldn't amount to much, would we? So since we find ourselves fashioned into all these excellently formed and marvelously functioning parts in Christ's body, you're pretty special. Let's just go ahead and be what we were made to be, without enviously or pridefully comparing ourselves with each other or trying to be something we aren't. Isn't that great? You and I, we find our meaning, our place of belonging in the body as a whole. You know, so often I can have conversations with different people at times, and they sense of this struggle because they don't feel like they fit. They look around and everybody else seems to have things in common, and they go, where do I fit? Where do I belong? And it's a wrestle and a struggle. But you know, it's exactly because you are different that you fit. You have a part to play in the body that no one else can. None of us really fit. We're all different to each other. We're a higgledy-piggledy bunch of people who've been thrown together by God, and it's in the beauty of our difference that we become a beautiful body that's able to be functioning well, where we find our meaning. You have a part to play in the body that no one else can, and you are just as needed in the body as anyone else, but you also need the body just as much as anybody else. But we don't just need one another. We don't just need community for effectiveness. I think that's where I kind of go so often in terms of it, is this idea of an imagery of the body, but something else I just feel God's been kind of putting across into me as I've been thinking about today. You know, there are ways that God is released to work in your life and in my life as we engage in community that are not possible in any other way. It will never happen if we just stay on our own. You see, when we engage in community, there are things inside of us that are exposed. Things that we might not even realize are there. As people push your buttons, as things happen that you don't like, different from the way that you choose them to be, suddenly you realize you're not as gracious or as patient as you thought you were. We rub against each other in community. And it creates a context where God is able to work and we are able to grow that would never be possible if we just stay on our own. You know, family, going back to that imagery, family are the people who, when you're with them, your worst qualities come out, as well as your best. And you realize how much you still need to deal with. And they're the people who are not afraid to challenge or to have an awkward conversation with you. And that can be hard, can't it? And, you know, sometimes we feel like we want to opt out when those conversations start. But, you know, I know Rosie is the person who sees me at my worst. And that leads sometimes to some difficult conversations and occasionally arguments. And it's not always fun. And because she's family, I can't opt out. But through that, God has been released to work in my life to deal with things in me that may never have come to the surface apart from it. If we want to grow to become like Jesus, then the stuff in us that needs dealing with needs to be exposed. And that happens best in community. Doesn't make it easy, doesn't make it fun, doesn't make it the thing that we want to be doing, but it's where it happens best. Do you know what else happens best in community, though? Encouragement and healing. You know, alone we can feel trapped and stuck in a cycle of behavior, or we can feel trapped and stuck emotionally. But as we engage in community alongside other people who love Jesus, that's where we will so often find freedom. You know, I'm sure we've all, I know I have, I'm sure we've all felt the reality of the truth, and we know the truth that our greatest wounds come through relationships. It's people who hurt us most, isn't it? But I want you to know another truth that is just as real and just as important, and that's that your greatest healing comes through relationships. When we wall off and we keep people at a distance because we don't want to get hurt, the effect of that may be that they're not able to hurt you. And so you see that as a win. But in the same way, when we do that, what happens is that while others aren't able to hurt us more, we stay broken. We stay stuck in the pain. Because the only way to find healing, for the healing that God is wanting to do to come to completion, is in community, is in relationships. Community is the place where we find encouragement and healing as people lift us up, as those wounds that have happened in the past, actually somebody's able to speak a word of life that brings wholeness. And where we get the opportunity to do the same for others. So I want to ask you a couple of questions again. Again, I've got to give you just 30 seconds to reflect on this. Maybe make some notes. Here's the first one. How is God inviting you to connect with and play your part in the body? And then number 2, are you aware of any way that you've held back or kept people at arm's length? And how is God inviting you to change that? So just 30 seconds. Okay, number 3, and this is my last point that we'll kind of bring things in. But number 3, community requires commitment and vulnerability. And this links in with what we've already been talking about a little bit. But I really believe that if we want community in the way that we long for, long-term, safe, open, honest relationships, that we have to commit to a group of people that are not perfect and that have their problems, and simply say, I am in it with you, and I will be real with you. And making ourselves vulnerable like that is not easy, is it? And if we go back to the creation story again, I think we can see why. Genesis 3, the first thing that happens as a consequence of sin, as a consequence of people choosing their own way rather than God's way, the first thing that happens is that shame enters into our lives. And as a result of that, Adam and Eve, they try to hide from each other, to protect themselves from being fully seen. And I think that's an instinct that we all have to battle with, that every one of us struggle with, because God did not design you to be like that. He didn't design things to be this way. He's designed for you and I to be fully known and to fully know. But that requires vulnerability, and vulnerability can feel really scary. It takes courage. It means taking down the mask and letting people in. And I'm not sure many of us know how to do it well. But it's in that place where we become known and we know that we are loved and we love. C.S. Lewis, who many of you know as the author of the Chronicles of Narnia, captured this powerfully when he wrote this. He said this: to love at all is to be vulnerable. Love anything and your heart will be wrung and possibly broken. If you want to make sure of keeping it intact, you must give it to no one, not even an animal. Wrap it carefully round with hobbies and little luxuries. Avoid all entanglements. Lock it up safe in the casket or coffin of your selfishness. But in that casket, safe, dark, motionless, airless, it will change. It will not be broken. It will become unbreakable, impenetrable, irredeemable. To love is to be vulnerable. Real community, a community where we are loved and we love, requires commitment and requires vulnerability. I think this is why communities like Alcoholics Anonymous are so effective. because they get it and they live it and they do it. It's a group of people who are committed to one another and are vulnerable with one another, where they know they're safe to come and to share all of their brokenness among a group of people who are then going to challenge them and call them up to a higher standard. And above all of the different kind of plans and strategies and ideas that we can have, the things that we might long for as a church, where we long to see God work in different ways, the most important call that is on us, that God speaks over us, is for us together to be a sacrificially loving family. And when we get that right, everything else kind of follows naturally. And this kind of community isn't possible if the only time that we see one another and the only time we join with other people within our church family is on a Sunday morning. Or once in a while when it happens to be convenient. If you're not part of a growth group, then I want to really encourage you to change that and to join one. Information about those is in the notice sheet, so come and have a chat to me. And if you don't have one or two people, even if you're in a group, if you then don't have one or two people who you're able to share life with and to be really honest and open with and to allow to speak into you and to challenge you, then I want to encourage you to change that. To be intentional about developing a relationship with someone in that kind of a way. And if you're not part of a group because of practical reasons and it just kind of is difficult, then I want to encourage you to be creative and invite people round and make opportunities for community that work and that fit with your life and the way things are. Come along to chill and chat, or one of the other ways that we can connect. Get involved and serve and volunteer in the food bank. Find a way to engage. And if you are part of a group and if you have people around you, then I want to say fantastic, keep at it. It's so important. Don't neglect it. Know that it's valuable. But I also want to say this, lean in. Don't just attend, be fully present. Fully there, fully committed and vulnerable. Because it's in those relationships that you will grow the most. And that you will find healing and love, and where you will discover how God can work in you and through you in the lives of others too. I love our growth group. We've got a fantastic group. They're a real joy. But it's not always convenient. Sometimes it's a squeeze and it's a rush, and you kind of feel like you're kind of just getting there. But I wouldn't be without it. And I see God at work in the midst of it in some beautiful ways. And I love this church. I love being able to gather like this on a Sunday and things like yesterday morning with a swap shop. We have an amazing community, and I love being a part of it and seeing how God's at work and all that he does. But as we look to learn from Jesus and grow in the way of community, I believe that God is inviting us and calling us up into something more and something new. To know what it is as a follower of Jesus in community, that it is not optional. It's your family. It's something that you need and where you are needed, and it requires commitment and vulnerability. If we are going to see and experience and get the joy of being in community in the way that God's designed us for, to be known and to know. How can you lean in? What does that look like for you to be intentional about engaging in community in that kind of a way this week or this month or this year? I'm going to ask the band to come up and we're going to have communion together. And, communion is a time when we get to come together as community. Get to come together as one body to celebrate that we have one Lord and one Savior who laid down his life on the cross and rose again from the grave, defeating death so that we could be forgiven, so that we could be made whole, so that we could have a relationship with him, but even more than that, so that we could be adopted into his family, so that we would be connected with one another, because it's not good for us to be alone. And it's also the time when we come to Jesus and we say, Jesus, I'm making the choice to be vulnerable with you. To be real and honest, to confess your sin, where you've been getting it wrong and choosing your way rather than his better way. And so as we come to communion, I want to encourage you to do that. I want to encourage you to be vulnerable with Jesus, to be real with him. It's the starting point. And as you're vulnerable with him, as you receive his love for you and his forgiveness, and as you allow him to meet with you, then just ask him that question. Ask him the question, how, Jesus, are you inviting me? Are you calling me into community? To be committed and vulnerable in this family where you have placed me today. What does that look like? What's the step that you want me to take?